Hello everyone, it's Inky here, and today we're going to do something a little different. This is going to be the first in a new series, where I discuss and analyse ideas in science fiction franchises that go against conventional wisdom, set to some well-done game footage. Our first episode is going to be continuing our Star Trek theme with one of the big ones, the Borg. Everyone knows that the Borg went from one of the best sci-fi villains in history to something of a joke. But did they? Let's dive into the inky depths. Let's begin by considering the history of the Borg on the screen. Our first encounter with the Borg was in the episode Q Who of The Next Generation, where the crew of the Enterprise D were hurled into unknown space by the entity Q to demonstrate their complacency. A Borg cube appeared and was apparently crippled in an initial firefight before regenerating and proving it could outrun and thoroughly outgun the Federation flagship. After their narrow escape with Q's aid, the imminent threat came to fruition 2 years later in The Best of Both Worlds, where a cube entered Federation space. The Enterprise was attacked, and Captain Jean-Luc Picard abducted and assimilated to create the entity known as Locutus. Subsequently, the cube annihilated a fleet of 39 starships with minimal effort at the Battle of Wolf 359, which we got a glimpse of in the pilot episode Deep Space Nine, Emissary. Eventually the cube was defeated when Picard was rescued, giving the Enterprise access to Borg command codes. The cube self-destructed to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. Finally, the Borg appeared in the linked episodes I, Borg and Descent, where an injured Borg drone, who came to be known as Hugh, was brought aboard the Enterprise and began to develop individuality. This later spread to other drones, causing an entire ship to be cut off from the collective, and to come under the control of the rogue android Law. Our next contact with the collective proper was in the movie First Contact, where a second invasion of the Federation reached Earth. Thanks to Captain Picard's knowledge, the cube was destroyed, but ejected a smaller ship that attempted to travel through time to assimilate Earth prior to the first warp flight. The Enterprise followed and was nearly assimilated before it could destroy the Borg incursion. The ramifications of this would eventually be explored in the Enterprise episode Regeneration, where several Borg drones were revived and sent a message towards the Delta Quadrant before being destroyed, implicitly triggering the initial contact of Q Who, where the Borg cube was already headed towards Federation space. Finally, we have Star Trek Voyager, where they appeared a total of 22 times, not counting the starring role of liberated Borg drone 7 of 9. There's a lot to cover there, and we will look at that later. So here's the central question. If we accept that the Borg became considerably less intimidating, then what's to blame? Star Trek Voyager is usually named as the main culprit. There is something to the idea that overuse of an antagonist can lead to their decay as a credible threat, as the heroes need to keep defeating them and thus proving that they're really not so scary after all. However, there are two earlier points that do get referred to. Most people agree that First Contact was a fantastic movie. I'll probably discuss it in a future episode, but it does get lined up for criticism. I'm right at the point where the Borg shifted wholesale from only interested in technological assimilation to being effective space zombies. It also introduced the concept of the Borg Queen, which not everyone liked. Putting a face to a faceless foe could be argued to reduce their threat value. The other point regards Hugh. Some argue that I, Borg and Descent humanized the Borg by giving us any insight into their internal workings. To an extent, 7 of 9 in Voyager did the same, by providing a Borg drone removed from the collective, and all the information that that offers, both in and out of universe. The Borg's mystique went out the window. So, those are the charges. Let's put them to one side for a moment, and consider what the Borg actually are, and how an entity like the Federation would respond to it. The Borg are known for two key aspects: their ability to adapt to just about anything, and their driving goal to assimilate. They integrate knowledge and technology, and use their hive minds to disseminate that information. A single drone has more information at its disposal than most civilizations, and can use that to adjust its shields and weapons on the fly to counter any assault. This, of course, scales up to starships, facilities, battle tactics, and the like. We saw in Q Who that a phaser blast killed a Borg drone, but the second one which beamed in was completely immune to Worf's phaser fire. Similarly, the main weapons of the Enterprise D blew large holes in the cube, but the second engagement, after the Borg regenerated and adapted, resulted in barely a scratch despite heavy use of phasers, photon torpedoes, and everything that the Enterprise had to offer. But just how good is that ability in practice? We saw in the Best of Both Worlds that the Federation was not at its most prepared. They knew that the Borg was coming, but in a line given by Commander Shelby, the anti-Borg weapons which were being developed would not be ready for another 18 to 24 months. Despite this, the Enterprise D was still able to give a good accounting for itself, despite not doing the level of damage that we saw in Q-Who. By simple virtue of modulating phaser frequencies, in Shelby's words, to not let them adapt, they were able to do enough damage to the Borg cube to disable the tracked beam which had captured the Enterprise. Similarly, although the technical knowledge of Jean-Luc Picard was undoubtedly the key element in the Borg's ability to annihilate the Federation fleet, the Enterprise D was able to survive for far longer in a direct engagement with the Borg cube than any of the starships that had been involved in the battle. This was definitely in part due to the fact that a Galaxy-class starship was at the cutting edge of Federation technology at the time, but it still demonstrates that the Borg's ability to adapt and overcome, even with a significant advantage, is definitely not unbeatable. It's also worth noting that the Borg's ability to adapt has always been much stronger and more noticeable on a ground level. Borg drones have typically been able to adapt to incoming weapons fire far quicker than starships. Even in their initial appearance in Q-Who, a Borg drone's death from a phaser blast was all that was required to develop a successful counter to Federation hand phasers. Meanwhile, the main cube took 3 high-powered phaser blasts from the Enterprise D and suffered significant damage without being able to adapt in time. It was only after regeneration, a process which took some time, that the cube had developed defences which were able to counter the Federation phaser banks and photon torpedoes. This has been a regular feature of the Borg every time that they have appeared on screen. The regular cry of "they've adapted" happens every time that a Borg firefight occurs on the ground, whereas it has never been a major feature of starship combat. It's not hard to extrapolate from Shelby's initial command in The Best of Both Worlds of "don't let them adapt" that it's much easier to keep phasers, photon torpedoes, and other starship weapons cycling into ranges that the Borg have difficulty adapting, whereas ground weapons are considerably less customizable on the fly. Despite this, it's worth noting that the Federation has had some success in ground confrontations with the Borg, even in rolling battles like the one in First Contact. Even if a phaser only gets off a few shots before it is adapted to, the Federation has consistently been able to remodulate its weapons in order to get a few more shots off in the next encounter. It's also worth noting that the Borg have consistent difficulty in adapting to kinetic and projectile-based weaponry, as seen from Picard's use of a holographic Tommy gun in First Contact, and Worf's regular use of Klingon martial arts and melee weapons. So in conclusion, although the Borg's ability to adapt to incoming damage, modulate their own weapons to maximize efficiency, and assimilate technology for future use are all undoubtedly powerful, it's also easy to overestimate their capabilities and their usefulness. The third major feature of the Borg Collective is their hive mind. Millions, billions, possibly even trillions of minds all working in concert. Through this unimaginable level of parallel processing, the Borg can deal with any problem, adapt to any technological barrier, and counter any tactic. It's a powerful and terrifying concept. After all, killing one means nothing to the whole. But what does that actually mean in practice, and how could it function? The Borg Collective is highly unusual and possibly unique in modern science fiction, in that it is a collective made up of involuntary minds. The number of individuals contained within the collective who are voluntarily assimilated is probably very small, although one hesitates to say 0. Moreover, this is more than just the idea of using minds as a form of parallel processing to increase your computing power. Individual Borg, although the term individual Borg is something of a contradiction in terms, have expressed various opinions and ideas which clearly demonstrate a form of indoctrination. Hugh, Locutus, and to an extent Seven of Nine, all believed that assimilation was a benevolent act, and demonstrated confusion at the idea of anyone resisting. Indeed, I have seen some people suggest that resistance is futile, is not in fact a threat, but meant to be a form of compassion. Don't worry, you'll be one of us soon. However, taking individuals and so thoroughly warping their ideas and their minds to the point where they believed that the horror that was done to them was in fact a good thing, and that everyone else should take part in it as well, does lead to some conceptual problems. To wit, who's doing the indoctrinating? It can be argued that the Borg are a self-perpetuating organism, that whatever initially created them, and I'm not going to go into the various theories about that because, to be honest, I don't really like any of them, created the initial programming, and that was all that was needed. The Borg simply indoctrinate others, because that's what they do. However, if your whole process is based around taking individuals, crushing them down into computing power, and removing any kind of free will or ability to think, then you're not going to make good decisions. Or indeed, decisions at all. It's certainly possible to indoctrinate people to the point where they agree with what is happening, but that's quite a long way from actually participating in an active fashion. Consider for a moment another classical hive mind civilization in modern science fiction, the Geth from Mass Effect. Insert spoilers here. The Geth are a functional hive mind made up of thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of programs. The Geth character that one interacts with in Mass Effect 2 and 3, Legion, consists of around 10,000 programs. These programs analyze the current situation, work together, have arguments, and then build a consensus. From this consensus, their individual, air quotes, individual, Legion makes decisions and takes actions. However, the Borg can't do this. The Borg's strength is in their parallel processing and the sheer volume of information that they have. An individual mind doesn't work faster just because it's connected to a hive mind. Yet the Borg are able to adapt, make decisions, and operate far faster than a consensus-based approach could possibly allow. Furthermore, the idea that individual Borg have all been brainwashed to the point where they all think along exactly the same lines and make exactly the same decisions is simply not true. We saw in the episode Infinite Regress that Borg vessels actually have a device specifically designed to help modulate all of the individuality and remove all of the chaos inherent in that, the vinculum. Indeed, I would suggest that the Borg's ability to assimilate people is simply not advanced enough to be able to remove individuality and bring everyone to that level of similarity. Furthermore, I'd even argue that that would go against the Borg's central philosophy of adaptation and evolution towards perfection. If every existing drone thinks the same way, and every future drone will be assimilated to think the same way, it will actually counteract the ability to evolve and become more perfect. So let's recap for a moment. The Borg are a hive mind on a truly colossal scale, made up of involuntary individuals who have been press-ganged into service for their information and their ability to parallel process, along with their innate muscle and meat capabilities. However, this is not a system which is capable of creating a consensus-based approach to decision-making and actions, based upon what we've seen of their level of technology, their psychology, and their society, in as much as you can call it one. It's for this reason that I find the idea of the Borg Queen to actually be fairly natural, and this is something which I'll be covering in more detail later, as to the exact role of the Queen, and why she doesn't seem to die. But most importantly, we can just look to a line from her in First Contact as to her role in the entire setup. She states, "I am the Borg," but more importantly, that she brings order to chaos. The Borg Queen enables the Borg Collective to function at an efficient pace, by offering a consensus and a direction. Let's leave the Borg aside for a moment and consider how an entity like the Federation might fight such a terrifying foe. For a start, where were the Federation at the time of Q Who? We know that they had recently come out of a war with the Cardassian Empire, and that there were numerous border skirmishes with the Ferengi at the time. However, it's been quite some time since the Federation had been in any real conflict with a foe which had any kind of technological edge over them. The Cardassians were formidable, but they were definitely some way behind Federation technology. Furthermore, the Federation, and Starfleet in particular, have always claimed to not be a military organization, but primarily one of exploration. The Galaxy class, the Federation flagship, was first and foremost a science vessel, with large areas devoted to science labs, civilian population, and other features which are thoroughly out of place on a military warship. Despite this, it had enough firepower and defences to comfortably match any vessel which it might run across, even up to and including the massive Romulan Deredex class warbirds, arguably the most powerful vessels in the known galaxy at the time. The Federation simply had no need of dedicated warships because the combined science vessels which they had the capabilities to counter dedicated warships of other races. Even in the unlikely event of a Klingon attack, or a Romulan one, the Federation was confident in its capabilities, and those two major rivals of the Federation were not likely to engage in all-out war. The Klingon Empire had been at peace with the Federation for nearly a century at this point, and the Romulans, after the initial Romulan War 2 centuries previously, had shown no interest in open conflict with anyone, preferring to operate in the shadows and against helpless targets. So in this way, the Borg were an entirely new kind of enemy, even disregarding their technological capabilities. The Federation had not faced an implacable foe like this since the Klingon Wars during the original series era. Consider the timeline for a moment. The events of the Best of Both Worlds took place 2 years after the events of Q-Who. The line about 18 to 24 months before implementation of anti-Borg weaponry matches up quite interestingly with the development of the Defiant class, the Quantum Torpedo, and eventually the Sovereign class. The Intrepid might not have been specifically developed for dealing with the Borg, but it was definitely a much more aggressive type of vessel than many of its predecessors. That's not even accounting for smaller innovations, like the idea that the random frequencies don't let them adapt line from Shelby became integrated directly into phasers to enable that to become automatic. We can even see that effect on ground weapons, as classically phasers had only been good for 1 or 2 shots, but by the time of first contact, they clearly had some more lifetime before the Borg adapted to them, and the phasers had to be retuned. The Federation had also learned from Wolf 359 that you couldn't have just dedicated warships sitting on standby. The very real possibility of a Borg incursion, and later on the lessons of the Dominion War, meant that you had to have every vessel ready to counter any enemy. Thus it makes sense that anti-Borg weaponry and technology would have become standard issue on every starship produced. Thus I don't find it particularly unnatural that an Intrepid class like Voyager would be in a better shape to take on a Borg vessel than the Galaxy-class Enterprise D was at Q-Who, or possibly even during the events of the Best of Both Worlds. This certainly doesn't mean that the Federation was in a position where it could take on the Borg comfortably. We saw that the Battle of Xerxes-001 in First Contact was extremely bloody, and even the Defiant, a vessel custom designed to take on the Borg, was severely damaged and in danger of being destroyed before the Enterprise arrived. So let's talk about Voyager for a moment. The regular criticism of Voyager is that they took on the Borg too often and defeated them too easily. But let's take a look at that statement for a moment, and take a look at just how often the Voyager actually took on the Borg and how much damage they did, because I think you might be surprised. Although the Star Trek Wikipedia site Memory Alpha lists 22 episodes in which the Borg appeared in Star Trek Voyager, out of all of these, only 4 involve direct confrontations with the Collective. All others involve only references, hallucinations of some kind, or wreckage. So let's go over each of those one by one. The first episode, Scorpion, involved the Borg under attack by an unknown entity known as Species 8472. Although notorious for involving large numbers of Borg ships being destroyed almost casually, it's worth noting that Species 8472 was a foe entirely unlike anything that the Borg had ever encountered before. An extra-dimensional race were using biotechnology from a realm which had not even been theorized about. The Borg's strength is the ability to take all of their collected information and combine it to produce new results. But with no context and no previous experience, either directly or through one of their assimilated species, they had no way to adapt to their foe, who was clearly extremely powerful and advanced. Meanwhile, aboard Voyager itself, we had already seen as long ago as Borg that Federation technology was fully capable of containing individual Borg drones, given a little preparation. Regardless of Janeway's determination to cooperate with the Borg, I'm sure that the fact that the cargo bay could easily be vented to remove them, if the need should arise, was not lost on her. The second episode, Dark Frontier, only involved smaller Borg vessels during direct confrontations. Given Federation anti-Borg developments, the presence of 7 of 9 as an expert, and the fact that these were small scout vessels as opposed to dedicated combat vessels, means that I believe that Voyager's ability to defeat them was pretty believable. Later sequences relied upon stealth, and the arms race between the Hansen's stealth technology and the Borg's ability to adapt to it. I will admit that the Queen's behaviour and obsession with 7 of 9 is a little less believable, but I will cover this a little more again when I get to the Borg Queen section. The third episode, Unimatrix Zero, only touched upon Voyager because 7 represented a unique case of a former Borg drone who had achieved individuality and was doing pretty well. Hugh and the cooperative seen in Unity were off the grid. Voyager leveraged an existing weakness that, while unusual, is not unjustifiable. Considering the number of drones, it actually makes sense that a tiny group of them would have developed a partial immunity to the process, resulting in the creation of the Unimatrix Zero phenomenon. The fourth episode, Endgame, does involve large-scale destruction of Borg assets and the annihilation of a large section of the collective, but that's cheating because it used future technology. So in short, yes, Voyager did do remarkably well against the Borg, and there are a few instances which I won't try to defend. But I think that the case that the Borg were turned fluffy in Star Trek Voyager is a little overdone. All of this brings us on to our final point, that regarding the Borg Queen, or perhaps I should say, Queens. We have seen a total of 4 Queens. We can extrapolate a 5th, based upon a scene in First Contact, which implied that one was present for the assimilation of Jean-Luc Picard during the events of the Best of Both Worlds. Of the remaining 4, 1 was destroyed in First Contact, 1 was destroyed in Dark Frontier, 1 appeared in Unimatrix Zero, and 1 was destroyed in Endgame, although those last 2 may have been the same one. We know from the example of the Dominion that it is possible to clone a person and their personality, including their memory. The Vorta. Weyoun died repeatedly in violent and unanticipated situations, but always seemed more or less caught up on the situation. It's not that hard to conclude that the Borg have a similar capability, especially when you consider the fact that the Dominion do not possess a hive mind, but the Borg do. So based upon this, why would the Borg choose to send such an important individual in the collective into the front line in not 1 but 2 invasions of the Federation? Is the Federation just that high a priority that close-range guidance from the leader of the collective is necessary? On the contrary, if the Queen is a repeated copy of a single entity, whether custom designed by the collective or some original assimilated individual, why would they choose to have only 1 and not many? The benefits are obvious. Borg space is stated to be vast, and the number of ongoing operations at any one moment must be similarly massive. Having a dedicated leadership unit for each important operation enables the collective to put its full focus on any given one, rather than having the risk of being overloaded and distracted. Additionally, The fact that the Queen is a clone of a single individual over and over removes the problems of consensus and differing opinions that were inherent in the concept of the entire Borg collective operating purely via consensus. Each Queen is in fact the same person, just repeated over and over, thus they can be relied upon to agree in all cases. The example of the Dominion does show that such a process can go wrong, as was the case with the rogue Wayoon, but a hive-mind collective will be able to pick up on such a problem instantly and remove the aberrant individual. Most importantly, the existence of a multitude of Borg Queens enables the collective to experiment. Consider for a moment that the tactics of the Borg when dealing with the Federation in particular have altered every time a Borg Queen has died. During the events of Q-Who and the Best of Both Worlds, the Borg were a primarily destructive force. They assimilated Jean-Luc Picard, but showed no interest in mass assimilation otherwise. Although it should be noted that a number of crewmen were declared missing during the course of Q-Who, and could well have been assimilated. However, after the destruction of that Queen, and the failure of that invasion, the Borg started showing more interest in direct assimilation of Federation personnel, evidently valuing their particular traits in their technology, personality, and skill set, rather more than previously. The failure of the second invasion and the second Queen, the one who died in First Contact, resulted in the Borg becoming more interested in the potential of individuals, as can be seen with the future Borg Queen's interest in 7 of 9. There is of course also one final advantage to the existence of multiple Borg Queens and the repeated iterations and production of them. The events of Endgame imply that the Borg have been removed as a threat, but the Borg have been extremely efficient at removing damaged components in the past. They have self-destructed vessels at risk of being captured, they have removed important components and then eliminated damaged vessels or drones. Why would they not have a similar contingency for their leadership units? The neurolytic pathogen which infected the Borg collective and the Borg Queen in particular, bringing chaos to order, as Janeway put it, was a direct strike at a definite weakness of the Borg collective. However, it's not unique by any means. Previous episodes have looked at the idea of pathogens of some kind or another infecting the Borg collective and thus being transmitted throughout it, but in each case the Borg simply cut off the affected area. The neurolytic pathogen was clearly far more effective due to being based upon future technology, but what's to say that that particular infected Queen and the units under her control were not simply cut off from the collective once the main body realized what was happening? The remainder could simply rebuild, grow a new Queen, and proceed to rebuild what was lost, without any serious long-term consequences. This, I think, makes far more sense in the context of previous encounters with the Borg and their overall philosophy of redundancy and removal of damaged components. Putting this all together, we can look at the idea that the Borg collective is not one gigantic monolithic organization, but instead individual cells, each controlled by a Borg Queen, which oversees operations, experiments with new tactics and technologies, and then corroborates its results with the rest of the collective, whether those are successful or a failure, or indeed the death of the Queen in question. From there, the collective can adapt and proceed accordingly. So, we come back to the original question posted by this video: who nerfed the Borg? At this point, I feel it's appropriate to quote Gul Dukat. I found it wise never to underestimate Federation technical skill or Captain Sisko's resourcefulness. While much is made of the Borg's ability to adapt, I sometimes feel that in these arguments, people underestimate the capabilities of the Federation. Bear in mind that the encounters with the Borg were spaced out over several years, during which the finest minds of a very technologically advanced and diverse civilization were dedicated to working out ways to counter them. It's worth comparing to the situation that Dukat was referring to, the fact that the Federation had worked out a counter for the apparently unbeatable Dominion phased polaron weapons, which had previously been able to punch straight through Federation shielding. Considering the number of opportunities that the Federation had to experience phased polaron weaponry, both in terms of studying them and being on the receiving end, the ability to create a counter which made shields functional again in the amount of time that they did was quite impressive. Not up to Borg standards, of course, but the Federation doesn't have a hive mind hierarchy, or the same sheer wealth of information at their disposal. It's also worth noting that in each instance with the Borg that we see, it is our heroes at the helm, and whatever else we may say about them, they do tend to be the Starfleet's best and brightest. It makes sense, in a way, that the incarnation of pure technology as a means for advancement is best countered by bright and inventive individuals. Anyone who has played online games will know that having a better character isn't necessarily going to help you if you don't know how to use it. The combination of advanced tactics, inventive technological developments, and the sheer brazen heroism of Federation captains makes for a combination that the Borg were having difficulty with. And while we can make the argument that the Borg will have faced many opponents like the Federation in the past, we don't actually have any evidence of this. We don't know anything about Borg history, their past conquests, their past opponents. As far as we know, the Federation may in fact be the most advanced and deadly opponent that they have faced. Their previous opponents, regardless of their technology levels, may have been less organized, less numerous, or simply less driven. I'm not going to try to make the case that Voyager's representation of the Borg was flawless. It was somewhat flanderized, and the idea of the Borg Queens being experimental and risk-taking because they can afford to be only goes so far to explain some stupidity. But I also feel that the case that they were significantly less dangerous and less threatening is a little overstated. There comes a point where the idea that the Federation would be continually helpless against the Borg is actually less believable than the idea that the Borg have become less threatening. Perhaps I'm buying into the ethos of Star Trek a little here, but isn't that kind of the point? Star Trek is an innately hopeful universe, a place where humanity has left behind all of its problems, has created a vast, peacekeeping organization whose only goal is self-improvement and exploration, finding what is unknown and reveling in it. In the midst of all this, is it really so unreasonable to believe that the Federation would be unable to counter such a powerful enemy, that they would not find some way to push through? Isn't that kind of the point of Star Trek? That's my thoughts, anyway. Hopefully I've given you something to think about, and perhaps reduced Voyager's reputation as being terrible, just a little. I liked Voyager. It might not have been Deep Space Nine, but it was by no means a terrible series. So thank you for joining me in this episode of Inky Depths. You can now surface and take a deep breath. Hopefully this was also entertaining. If you like this, leave a like, subscribe. There'll be more stuff like this coming up, along with more regular Star Trek Armada 3 content, and stuff from my other two contributors. Plus I'll be moving on to other franchises in the future. There is Star Wars content coming up at some point. I have stuff to say about Rogue One, believe me. So until next time, folks, stay safe. Oh yeah, and you'll note that I didn't talk about the Enterprise episode Regeneration. Yeah, I can't defend that. Go wild.